Hello. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. So, my name's Jessica Bellamy. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the lands on which this broadcast reaches and acknowledge First Nations people as the traditional custodians of this country and whose cultures are among the oldest living cultures in human history. I would like to pay respect to the elders of these communities, past and present, and extend that to emerging community leaders and to all First Nations people that may be listening in tonight. This was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. So, if I didn't already say hello, my name's Jessica Bellamy. I'm coming to you tonight on behalf of Toolkit's Regional Playwriting. And before I introduce our amazing guests tonight, I'll give you a really quick summary of what that is. That is a program that is run by Express Media in collaboration with some amazing partners, including Alicia Herman, Karklu, Country Arts South Australia, and the Copyright Agency. And it's a really lovely, dedicated process over 12 weeks where I get to work with some wonderful emerging regional playwrights in developing their craft and also offering dedicated sessions in aspects of playwriting craft. And this is one of those. So we've previously had sessions on sort of developing one's voice, one on character, setting, one on creative structure. And today we have one on dramaturgy, which is where I bring in the glorious Tasnim Hossain. So by introduction, Tasnim Hossain is a playwright, dramaturg and director. As a playwright, she has worked with ATYP, Shopfront Youth Arts and Canberra Youth Theatre and has written and performed solo work independently around Australia. She has worked with Q Theatre, BMEC, Arts Out West, Curious Works, Performance Space and Playwriting Australia as a dramaturg. She was the assistant director on Banging Denmark for Sydney Theatre Company and the House at Boundary Road, Liverpool at the Old 505 Theatre, and has directed readings for several new works. She has been an STC and Contemporary Asian Australian Performances Directors Initiative participant, a Griffin Theatre Studio artist, an MTC Women in Theatre Program participant, and resident playwright at ATYP. She was also a co-creator, co-writer and performer in Car Park Clubbing, a brilliant web series for ABC iView, which is also available on YouTube. And Tasnim is currently serving on ATYP's board. What a bio!
Hello.
Hello. Welcome. I'm so excited to talk to you tonight. How are you today in beautiful Sydney?
I'm doing well. It was a glorious day today. We, of course, have not had the lockdown that Melbourne has had. Yeah, it's been good. Oh, before I kind of got into it, I wanted to just say that, to acknowledge the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is where I am currently, and as well as the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And I live and work across both those lands.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So that might actually speak to something which maybe I'll ask you about now, which is that you are in Sydney at the moment, but you are originally from Queanbeyan, is that right?
I'm from Canberra. I'm across the border. Queanbeyan has cool kids though. It has like Omar Musa and Tommy Murphy and like the one Bond who was not English, like James Bond, who wasn't English, who's from Queanbeyan. Yeah.
There you go.
Queanbeyan is kind of cooler than Canberra, but it's like, you know, the Wollongong to Sydney or the Geelong to Melbourne. We have but they have some excellent humans.
There are some amazing people from there. Forget about Canberra. It's all about there.
I know. I'm like, I went to the same high school that Gough Whitlam went to. So there we go. That's what I got.
Amazing. So, because of your amazingly wide-ranging areas of work and what you've done over the years, we've got a lot to cover. So, I'll sort of give a bit of a context of what we're going to talk about today. So, first of all, we've sort of I was reflecting on the fact that the name of this session is a bit of a nod to a old Aussie, not old, but a classic Australian comedy Frontline, where a news host who isn't very creatively invested in the work of his show will walk in and go, edit it there. And so I sort of used that as the name for this session, which was a bit facetious because, of course, the aspect of script development and editing and dramaturgy is a lot more detailed than just walking in and going, cut that. So that's sort of where I want to start with this at the moment. So I'd love to hear like a lot of people hear dramaturgy and might just go, firstly, how do I say it and what does it mean? So I'd love to hear a bit about just a definition of what it is and I guess how it was something that you started finding interesting to do as a career alongside your other pursuits.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think dramaturgy is an interesting one because actually when I'm talking to someone who has no familiarity with the theatre, that's what I say. I say it's basically an editor for a play. But like you were saying, Jessica, it's very much, it's not, it's kind of much bigger than that, depending on what the role is. So, you know, you could be an editor for a play, but you could also be the playwright's best friend, therapist, personal motivator, coach. You might also be the kind of advocate for the script in a production process. You might, you know, you could be doing a range of different things. I always think of dramaturgs as the natural nerds of the theatre. Most dramaturgs I've come across are very intensely passionate about a whole lot of things, but also know a whole bunch of stuff about a very strange selection of things. So yeah, I find it's quite an interesting role. And I think also for us, it's useful to kind of split it into two, because I think that what an institutional dramaturg does, or, you know, a literary manager or someone who might work at a big company like Sydney Theatre Company or Melbourne Theatre Company, what they do kind of day to day, along with doing the kind of script things that we think of, is also much broader and kind of across the company. And then like production dramaturgy, which is potentially what we're going to be talking about here, around kind of creating new work or working on existing work with a with perhaps a director or a writer.
Awesome. And so I guess that idea that you brought in, that phrase, which was institutional dramaturgy, which I remember finding that really exciting when we were chatting about planning this, because I don't think that was talked about as much like 10 years ago when I was studying theatre and playwriting. Like, we had assignments like plan a season, and that was the sort of dramaturgical lens that we took, and the theatre company having, or perhaps more questions to that degree, which actually I'd love if you could run us through. What sort of questions would an institutional dramaturg be asking or pushing forward in their role?
Well, I think dramaturgs, and I guess lots of everyone who works in the theatre, we ask the question why. And I think, you know, a director might ask that of an actor might ask that of a director, but I think a dramaturg in this particular context might ask it of the theatre company and about the, I guess, the industry in general. So, you know, if we are doing another Shakespeare, why? There's nothing inherently wrong with doing Shakespeare, but what is it that we're going to do with this one? If we are going to have casts that are overwhelmingly male, then why? Is there a reason? What are we seeking to kind of look at or examine? I think, you know, even kind of internally, we know that, you know, arts workers are generally of a particular background, cultural, socioeconomic, whatever. And so for me, I guess dramaturgy in that context means actually looking at the structures and understanding why. So, you know, a production dramaturg will look at the structure of a play, will look at what, how each of the elements come together to create that whole. And I think for me, institutional dramaturgy is looking at an organization or an industry and asking the question about why and how things kind of fit together.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm really curious about examples either here or internationally where that asking of why has led to tangible changes. And I would love to know that in Australia it is really happening. But I guess, are there times that, even just from looking at versions of this role, where they've been able to implement things that actually sort of broaden the base of people that are feeling welcomed by this company, or that are being approached to make work by this company?
I think so. One of the roles that dramaturgs or literary managers usually have in a theatre company, particularly in this country and kind of across the world, because in different countries, in different theatre contexts, a dramaturg can be a slightly different thing. But in Australia, a lot of their work is looking at new work. So they would be involved in conversations or lead conversations about commissioning new work, about finding new writers. Like, we talk about for kind of emerging theatre artists, you're told to invite industry folk to your shows. And, that usually they're talking about directors or, whoever. But in this case, literary managers go out looking for that work. There's an organization, the acronym is LMDA. I think it's the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. It's like a big kind of association of literary managers all the way from Canada through the USA, all the way down into Latin America. And it's a group of literary managers and dramaturgs who actually have been talking about this quite a lot. There isn't, I don't think there is an equivalent here in Australia, but that particular group is very Black Lives Matter means. I mean, these are all things that our industry as a whole is working on. But I think the way that dramaturgs are looking at it, also within the lens of society, how we might bring a dramaturgical lens to society, understand meaning and narrative and stories in the world around us, I think is really, really interesting.
Wow.
I would check them out if you were interested.
Thank you. I'm already scribbling notes and we're only 12 minutes in. I realised that actually we sort of, because we jumped straight into the thick of some of these conversations, we missed the part of the chat about what made you say, I want to be part of this aspect of theatre. So not just the writing the stuff, but the working with companies and working with artists. How did you land on that trajectory?
I mean, it's not surprising that we jumped right in because, like I said, dramaturgs are nerds. So I'm like, yes, let's have this nerdy craft conversation now. So for me, it was really interesting. So I've always been a writer. Well before I wrote for theatre. I just like the theatre because you got to work with more people. When you're writing poetry, you're sitting in a room by yourself, and yes, as an extrovert, it's very boring. And then so writing was a thing that I really loved and gravitated towards, playwriting. But then I had this experience where I worked with a dramaturg once, and I was writing about a young Muslim man who takes his life in the story. And then I was trying to talk about mental health and expectations within the migrant community, kind of our role in the wider Australian society. And as I was talking to the dramaturg, he kind of boiled it down for me. Or like he reflected back what he'd heard from me, and he was like, oh, okay, so this character takes his own life because he can't reconcile his Muslim identity with his Australian identity. And like maybe it was me and I didn't have the craft to be able to write that story or, bring the nuance that I wanted. But that it was really gutting because that was absolutely not what I was trying to do. And the lack of nuance felt like, it was well-meaning, but I knew that the dramaturg and I did not share a lived experience with being second generation, being a person of migrant heritage, I think with all of those kinds of particular things that I was trying to unpack. And so as I kind of continued to write, I realized that actually I wanted to be for other people what I needed then. And didn't have. And actually, I found that really disheartening. And the dramaturg I was working with is lovely and we get along really well, but it just wasn't the right person for that project. And so I trained as a dramaturg in order to be able to be that person. I also had the realization that as a writer, you maybe work on, one play every 2 years or 3 years or whatever it is. But as a dramaturg, you can work on so many more. And I had this realization that I don't really care about who tells the story as long as it gets told. As in, like, it doesn't need to be me. If I can facilitate someone else telling a story, then that's still wonderful, because that's one more story that exists in the world that didn't before. And like, weirdly, I've worked a couple of times with people of Filipino heritage, and it's interesting because, like, being Bangladeshi is not the same as being Filipino, and being Muslim is not the same as being Catholic, but there are these like weird kind of parallels where we can kind of swap stories and we can get where people are coming from. So yeah, it's been a really wonderful experience in that way.
I love that. And it's been making me reflect on, like, I loved that phrase you said, the right person for this project, because part of me thinks that we're starting to sort of graduate to actually not just assuming that one type of person is the right theatre maker to collaborate with on a project. And also it then makes me think about, like, you mentioned the training for dramaturgy. I know I was always sort of turned off by some of the readings that were sort of essential dramaturgical research to do if you wanted to be in that role. Like, it was a lot of the kind of the dead white males that you just went, yeah,
totally.
And it's nice to actually think of, like, when we talk about being nerds, we're actually sort of not meaning nerds in terms of like, oh, I know every line from Shakespeare, or I recite Aristotle's Poetics to you with my eyes closed. But there's a different sort of like, we're sort of democratizing or decolonizing language and knowledge in some ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, thoughts on, or I guess if you have anything on that you would offer people.
Yeah, absolutely, because I found that really intimidating as well. I mean, I'm not classically trained. I didn't go to drama school. I wasn't an actor before I became this. I never studied at a university, and so it's all been stuff that I've learned on the job. And I think you're totally right about that nerdiness. That nerdiness comes from caring and being really passionate about something. Because I struggle to read poetics literally all the time. I read the Wikipedia article. I understand all the concepts. I have a very rudimentary, well, somewhat of an understanding of Brecht, but I'm not going to go out of my way to read it. But I can tell you all about South Asian women writing in Britain at the moment, or over the last 20 years. Because actually they're my touch points. And I can talk to you about, classical Indian forms of storytelling and story structures. I have a good understanding of like Western story structures, and I can talk to you about 3 acts. And I often do. But I think, historically we have had a particular kind of understanding of what theatre is and what theatre could be. People always talk about theatre as coming from the Greeks. And sure, I mean, Western theatre comes from the Greeks. But I think all cultures have had a performative art form. And there's a lot that we can learn, and a lot that might feel more comfortable. I remember there's a writer, Michael Muhammad Ahmed, who wrote a novel and then adapted it for stage, and he's worked as an actor before. And he was saying he wrote his book and then also his stage play as an oral story, as a form of oral storytelling. Like, first it was printed and then it was delivered as a solo show, as a one-man show. And that, has its roots in kind of Western, kind of oratory or kind of lyrical theatre making. But then also that's a Western lens. Like, that has existed in like Arab storytelling for a very, very long time. Like, in the poetry that was created, even in the way people understand the Quran as a piece of poetry, that kind of storytelling has existed in that culture. And so for us to say that it's only from the Greeks, or that's the lens through which we should understand it, is, I think, a little bit myopic.
Yeah. I love that. And it also speaks to the fact that models can be really different and we can change our expectations around them. Like, I was listening to this great Zoom kind of chat today with some people that APAM was running, and it was talking about multi-generational art making and about changing people's expectations about certain shows, and, you know, going in and instead of going in and going, when does it start, when does it start, when does it start, and expecting, you know, the lights and the flourish of the music and the curtain going up, actually the show has started the second you got there and were offered a cup of tea or a look around or a chat with a community member. It's so nice to remember that theatre is not just what some of those kind of dusty books tell us it is. It's so much wider and older and more joyful than a lot of that. By the way, I realised, because again, we've jumped into, people can at any stage ask us questions. We will answer them. We've just gone straight into it. But yeah, at any stage, especially if we're talking about something you want to know a bit more, or you'd love some examples, or even some of the like fantastic artists that Tasnim has just mentioned, and you want to know some more about any of them, feel free to ask. We would love that. So I guess the next sort of thing we mentioned wanting to talk about was the sort of dramaturg-writer relationship, because it is fascinating thinking about their roles with other parts of a company. But in some ways, I guess because we're talking about a playwright's toolkits here at the moment, a lot of how playwrights and emerging playwrights will work with a dramaturg is in a sort of that script editor, script development, script bestie sort of form. So I would love to sort of, I guess, just chat about like how for us as writers, we found it useful to either work with dramaturgs as the playwright, or to kind of interact in a dramaturgical role with writers. And some of the things you, I guess, like, maybe we'll start with when you are establishing a relationship with a writer. First of all, how that usually happens, and then what sort of process do you go on with them for getting their play to where it wants to get to?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question, because I think different dramaturgs do it in different ways. You know, a lot of dramaturgs will sit down with their writer and they've got the script in front of them. I prefer coffees. Well, no, I actually don't drink coffee at all. And English breakfast. But yeah, I will sit down with a writer and actually just get to know them, because I think most of your dramaturg's work is trying to facilitate the telling of the story that the writer is trying to create. So I think that understanding where the writer is at and what they're interested in is really important for me in the way that I practice. There are lots of dramaturgs who are less airy-fairy than that, but I think that's kind of how I work. And I will ask them lots of questions, and it's mostly about them as a person. And then as we kind of get into the script, I will ask questions kind of about the script, about the story, what they're interested in exploring, and then it will get kind of a little bit more focused on the work. And then kind of as we go through the process, it will become more about scenes or exchanges or character arcs, and then kind of narrow in. I found that actually, I think for me, and when I had this realization, it kind of felt like a light bulb. I think dramaturgy is mostly asking the right questions at the right time and sharing lots of information when and only when they're of use. Because I think, you know, you might look at something and you're like, oh my God, scene 5 is a complete trash fire. But that does not need to be shared, because while you work with the writer, they may work out it's a trash fire themselves, or they might work out something exceptional that makes the trash fire work. Or they might realize that what they're trying to do with that trash fire is not quite worked out. And then, you know, then it's something that I wouldn't need to say anyway. I mean, there's always a point where you're like, okay, no, maybe I need to tell them that it's a trash fire, or ask them why, or, you know, what's going on there. But I think that, yeah, it is the process of asking and always checking in with the writer to see if that's their intention, because I think that that's also really important in matching up intention with, I guess, output.
This is a fascinating thing, because I think sometimes there's this disconnect between like the tough questions a director is asking because they're so focused on I need to work out how to put this play on, and at the moment, scene 5 is a trash fire, for example.
Yeah,
we all relate to that. But also, like the dramaturg maybe being in the middle as the one mediating those questions, because I know a thing that directors so often ask, and it can be so hard in the like fledgling new little bird cracking out of a shell stage of writing a play. They'll often say, you know, what question are you asking? What is your central question of this work? And I guess one impression I'm getting is that part of the dramaturg is sometimes saying, here's the question that I think it is. Do you agree? Or do you think that's true? Or I guess, or
totally.
How you relate to those sorts of, those questions that directors always ask that it's hard for the playwright to really answer sometimes.
I think in that case, because I struggle with central dramatic question all the time, I ask it of other writers because sometimes they think like that. Because, you know, that's how they've been trained. And so usually I'd take a bunch of different approaches. But yeah, that thing that directors ask, because again, the useful thing to bear in mind is a dramaturg isn't the only person who thinks dramaturgically. Literally everyone thinks dramaturgically in the theatre. An actor will look at their character dramaturgically and, you know, how the arc works and what role they play in the piece. And a director will look at it dramaturgically and kind of break it up and think about what they're saying with each of those, you know, scenes or each of the choices that they're making. So I think that that's something that all theatre makers or anyone involved in the theatre does. But I think, I think there is a weird kind of responsibility that dramaturgs have for this. And I think it is there. Sometimes there is, depending on the relationship with the writer, a point where you do, you know, have that conversation that can be a little bit difficult. But yeah, it's always, like you said earlier, it depends on the project and it depends on the relationship. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I think it did. And there's actually a few questions pouring in, which will also provide even more detail to, I think, this fascinating direction we're in at the moment. So now the first one is actually one of the more recent questions, but then we'll sort of move backwards through the other questions from Remy. Thanks, Remy. What was your favourite project to work on as a dramaturg, and what made it such a positive experience?
So I worked last year with the Bathurst Memorial Entertainment Centre, Arts Out West, and the Q Theatre in Penrith on this project where it was like a partnership between the theatre in Penrith and the theatre in Bathurst, developing Bathurst-based playwrights or playwrights from Bathurst. And it was really interesting because I was working with two early career playwrights, but who were older than me, and they'd lived in Sydney for a bit, but had settled there. And just the process of like working with two writers at the same time, but two writers who worked really differently, who created very different work, who had different kinds of levels of exposure to theatre making was really, really wonderful. I think there's a moment of like professional pride when you feel like you've actually connected with someone, because a lot of these are very much, you know, arranged marriages. It's those writers didn't ask for me, but I'm what they got. And so that moment of when you're on the same page and when you know that person feels supported in order to, you know, further their story, their script, whatever it is, explore what it is that they want to do, is a really kind of fulfilling thing. And it was really lovely. And I got to hang out in Bathurst a couple of times last year, and I'd never been before. And yeah, it's just really lovely working with two theatres who are kind of regionally based. I mean, Penrith is, I guess, metropolitan Sydney, but still Western Sydney. And yeah, working with these companies that were very much focused on their local communities and their local artists was really wonderful.
That's gorgeous. I love that. And I've been reflecting on this question too, and how for me, so often it is when you connect as people and not just as artists. And all that not to say, like, you don't have to be best friends with everyone you ever collaborate with. And sometimes theatre, by being so familiar, you know, we do need to remember it's a
terrible
job.
With boundaries.
Terrible, exactly. But someone you can sit with and enjoy a meal, and, you know, maybe your value systems align in certain ways, or when dogs walk past, you both go like that and you can't like focus on the chat for 5 minutes. I think there's something in that. I don't think I don't think I've ever responded to a dramaturg who feels like this sort of monolithic, authoritarian, person that I have to bow down to and respect. Like I think it's probably the opposite of a meaningful dramaturgical kind of relationship to have for me.
I mean, it's a really interesting one because dramaturgs can kind of like, I don't know how they do it. I mean, I'm saying this as a dramaturg, but the dramaturgs I've worked with as a playwright, I don't know how they do it. They just like get inside my brain and they say the thing that I'm subconsciously thinking, like, do you secretly want to ditch your draft and start again? And then it feels like they've given me permission to do that. So yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful when that happens.
Yeah. Which is actually a funny question, like of when they do say the thing that is really tough. Like I remember when we were checking in a couple of weeks ago and we were talking about this session, and I think I had a couple of weeks before had a chat with the dramaturg for work who was like, this entire thread, tell me why it actually needs to be there. And the horrible realization was like, it doesn't need to be there. And I think you'd had a similar chat where the dramaturg was like, yeah, it's getting there, but the whole thing is stuck in a. Anyway, please speak for yourself.
Yeah, totally. It's funny because I've been working with 2 different dramaturgs on 2 different projects, and and I mean, as a playwright, that's the thing. You forget how vulnerable you feel because you're like, oh, here's my baby, don't smoosh it. I mean, smoosh it, but don't it. Which sometimes it feels like. And just feeling really like stressed about it, and I'm like, oh no, it is a trash fire. But then like through the process it's like, okay, so there is a lack of narrative drive, and I'm like, damn it, I knew it. But also you remember, it doesn't need to be this story. This is a commission that's really open. We don't need to have it be this. And it feels like potentially this is what the frame through which you've been seeing it. It might be worth thinking about, is there another frame? Is there, a different approach you'd like to take? Are there, elements that you'd like to change? Or do you want to start the whole thing again? Or like, bin it and do something, the dance performance. And so, yeah, it's actually incredibly freeing. And it's really stressful to have those conversations because you're like, oh no, my work is crap. And I mean, in an unhealthy artist way, you're like, oh, that means I'm crap, which it doesn't. And so I think having dramaturgs who you trust is really, really important. And like, some dramaturgs are that monolith kind of person who they know everything. And some people really respond to that. But that is not my flavor, not the way I work as a dramaturg or as a playwright.
Absolutely. It's funny too, because it's something that's popped into my head is that sort of gut feeling that you can get after a good collaboration. And I think, artists and women and, a lot of different like people, we need to get better at trusting our gut feelings about things generally. But for example, if I leave a session with a dramaturg and I feel excited and ready to implement what they've said to me, I know it's a good relationship. Whereas there's times I've left a session of a whole lot of questions sort of directed at me and just gone, oh, I don't know what to do. End of day, is never going to write again. And I don't know. I mean, I don't think the dramaturg should fix everything because it is sort of the playwright's job. But is there a degree of like that sort of the support or the duty of care, or even the like giving them what they need to get to the next step that you think is part of it?
Absolutely. I think that speaks to the like only sharing information at the point at which it's useful is really important. And I think you kind of start to learn that as you do it. Like, and I think directing is the same. As a director might have an actor who just always delivers a line in a way that just, it kills the comedy, or like the pathos behind it doesn't come through, or it's out of character. And then, but maybe that line isn't the thing, and they like do it from week 1, but that isn't the thing that you need to talk about in week 1, because that'll change as the actor kind of inhabits that character more and more. And by the time, like week 3 or week 4, like week 3, you might need to actually tell them, but by week 3, they might have worked it out for themselves. So I think it's that. I think it's the duty of care is understanding, that you've been trusted to work with this person on this work, which, is always a privilege for me anyway. And B, that we may have lots of thoughts, but not all of them, opinions and questions, but not all of them need to be said at once. And I think being able to kind of understand people is also useful. So always look to see if you can see the panic in the playwright's eyes and then dial it down.
I love that. Yeah, it's almost like we have to have that degree of social awareness to do this.
Yeah. I feel like it's something that lots of people, especially in like newfangled dramaturgy, are into this EQ. But maybe I think theatre across the board should probably be quite into EQ. We should have more kind of emotional intelligence.
So true. So true. I love it. Now, more questions are piling in, so we're gonna work through some of those because I think they'll cover a lot of what is on our agenda anyway.
Absolutely.
One of them from 6:22 p.m. Sorry for the wait. Is how different is it, either editing or writing a play versus a film or a movie script? So over to you.
Well, that's a really good question, and I can answer it because I've been training as a story editor for film and television for the last little while as well. Basically, they're very similar. They're very similar in that you're working with an artist who has a story that they want to tell, and you need to not crush them and also get the story to the end. But I think the big differences that I've found is in the theatre, I don't worry about an idea being commercial or its kind of place in the industry commercially. I think about its place in the industry potentially in like, have we heard this story before? Where might it sit? That kind of thing. But I'm never like, oh, look, it's kind of a bit like this, and the issue is going to be finding financing and, it's going to be hard. I mean, that's not necessarily a a story editor's job. But it is, those kinds of considerations, those commercial considerations exist a lot more, obviously, in screen, just because there's a lot more money involved than there is in theatre. And I think it conventions, like obviously theatre has very strong conventions as well, both kind of general kind of structure-wise, particularly when we're looking at it through a Western lens of, a 3-act structure, or, the hero's journey or whatever. But in film and television, they talk about that stuff all the time. It's like, on page 12, you should have your inciting incident, and on page 65, and that is really, like, there are people who swear by those things. So I think that those are the big ones. Oh, also genre considerations. Like, I don't think people in theatre don't really talk about genre, not unless it's a person talking about it for marketing purposes. But in screen, in film and television, people talk about genre so much more. The other thing, just in terms of writing, is of course with playwriting, you basically, the tool that you're in control of is the dialogue and the silences. That's kind of how I think about it, when people are speaking and when they're not speaking. And then, often directors and designers or whatever will put their spin on it, depending on, how much you put in. I mean, there are lots of people like Pinter who are like, it must be like this, the staging must be like this, and you can't do it any other way. But by and large, directors will put their take on it. I mean, the same is true for film and television. Directors will put their take on it. Producers absolutely will put their take on it. But, you actually describe the scene so much more in like a screenplay than you would for a stage play. Yeah.
Beautiful. Such a great insight. Thank you so much. Now, the next question. And this is always one of those put on the spot questions because my brain immediately goes blank when people ask me about people that I like to read or influenced by. But a listener was curious about modern writers or dramaturgs who you think are worth checking out that maybe don't get, they don't get the Aristotle treatment.
Well, actually, I was like, here's one I prepared earlier. So, Dramaturgy in the Making is the book that I have been referring to. It's super interesting. So, Katalin was actually in Queensland last year in a residency for UQ. I think it was last year before. So, this book basically looks at different ways of working as a dramaturg. And in it, there are interviews with like Van Badham, who is a Victorian-based playwright, Australian playwright, but she's also worked as a literary manager and dramaturg at the Finborough in London. It also has an interview with Brian Quirt, who's the current president of LMDA, and how he works with night swimming, which is his company in Toronto, and like a whole bunch of other kind of case studies to talk about the breadth of how dramaturgs work. I found it super, super helpful. Like, if you don't want to shell out to buy a book, she does great chats on YouTube. I'm like, I shall hold it up so you can type her name, because I can't say it.
What's the name again? Because it's a little blurry for some
Yeah,
people.
oh, right. It's Kulin Nation. I probably said it wrong. It's Hungarian.
No worries. Someone at Express Media who's glorious will probably be madly Googling and tweeting at the moment.
I love it. Express Media wizards in the background. Yeah, I found that super, super helpful. And I think, like, there's also a website called HowlRound, which is a US-based theatre blog, which talks about productions. It talks about kind of conversations that are happening in the theatre. I find that always really, really helpful. Recently, they had a whole range of stuff around intimacy, coordination and direction, which I thought was really interesting. They had a whole bunch of stuff around the impact of Black Lives Matter. I mean, kind of ongoing, but especially in the last few months. They're really good at kind of working with people across different theatre industries in different countries, which is, yeah, really, really helpful and a great place to kind of hear about, I guess, new writing, modern playwrights, and kind of those dramaturgs as well. And also, it's a great way to kind of find, to read about that process of creating work, which I always find really fascinating. And the LMDA website is also super, super helpful to find out more information specifically about dramaturgs.
Oh, we missed the name of the website. The internet went a bit funny for that one, or mine did. What was that last website you mentioned?
So the LMDA, the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. I think that's what it stands for. I feel terrible not being able to remember, but yeah. That website's already been shared, but that's excellent. It's super helpful.
Perfect. So the book's there for anyone who wants to.
I signed up as an honorary Canadian to access.
That's awesome. Why not? And there was another question that that came up as well. And don't let our gradual asking of them stop you from asking new ones, because they're really great questions. This one is asking about how young editors, or I guess dramaturgs, interested. Okay. So no, actually, they're specifically asking if they're editors, but they're interested in dramaturgy, I guess, for stage, and they're not really in the playwriting scene, in inverted commas, what sort of things might be useful for them? What do you think, Tasnim?
I think what is useful there is making friends with emerging theatre makers. Like going to shows. I mean, obviously that's very hard right now. But seeing kind of what's out there is really useful, and seeing kind of the work that's being made. Like sometimes I'll see new work and I'll feel like, oh, maybe this work could have used some dramaturgy in terms of just like clearing up maybe what the piece was about, and actually, is the experience of the audience and what the writer's trying to explore, kind of matching up. I think it's a good question, and it's a hard one. I feel like I became a dramaturg accidentally, but I also feel like I became a playwright accidentally. Like I said, grew up in Canada, I thought I was going to be a public servant. I think it's about finding peers. That's the only way that I've managed to do anything in the arts, is finding people who are at the same level in me as me, and then kind of offering services for each other. Like, would you look over my script? Would you, can you do a reading of it? Hey, my actor friends, come over. I will give you a cheese plate. Can you read this? Can you read my script for me so I can hear it out loud? I think there are also some other groups, kind of a little bit more casual, they might gather over Facebook or whatever, and people will do play reading. So I know that there are some people, like in Melbourne, for example, who will often gather their friends together to do a play reading. Or, I mean, if you're interested in plays, bring your friends together to do a play reading. I think actually hearing plays out loud is the best way to, the easiest way to kind of understand structure and all of the kind of dramaturgical elements that go into making something. I mean, obviously, don't bring them around, do it over Zoom or whatever. But yeah, I think that that's a useful way to do it.
I think that's fantastic. And the other thing is that, like, it's a lovely way to make friends. I remember when I moved to Melbourne and I'd written a new play, and my friend David said, well, I know these people. If you're happy to, like, you know, have them over, we'll all read your play. And now, you know, like, one of them is Fleur, who was our guest a few weeks ago on Toolkit. So, like, you can really properly meet people by just asking. And I think your point is great too, that you want to kind of know what's out there before deciding, firstly, that it's for you, but also that that you're coming in with a real confidence because you're aware of different types of theatre, what you like, what you don't, the playwrights that you're really drawn to, and just a feel of why you're doing this endeavour, because it. Like going into a literary editing role, just as people there would want to know why you're there. I think the same thing does apply for playwriting. You know, why do you care enough to do this? Why do you care enough to be here? What do you love about theatre? Is always nice to have answers to go into these things. So much to talk about. 9 minutes left. We're going to find a way. I kind of want to talk about a big question that is probably one of the big ones. Then if we've got time, we can go into other stuff. But one thing that you kind of have some really interesting things to say about is the idea of the dramaturgical lens. So I would love to hear you explain what that is and how it's something that you do apply to your process.
Okay, I feel like, let me know if I'm not answering quite in the way that you mean. But for me, I guess, like I said earlier, you know, thinking about something dramaturgically isn't the sole domain of a dramaturg. It's very much around asking questions about choices and why they're made and how they fit into, I think, bigger questions. So I think about it as very much like both a macro and a micro. Well, that was the wrong way around. A macro and a micro view of a work. So, you know, it might be the questioning, say, if two people are facing each other and having an argument, a man and a woman in a heterosexual relationship, what does that look like? What does that mean? If the woman is seated and the man is standing over her, what does that mean? That's something that a director would think about and an actor would think about. What does it do if the man is actually sitting on the ground and the woman is standing over him? Like, all of these things are things that we feel or we have a certain kind of emotional response to, but we don't necessarily express in the same way. If we do another production of Shakespeare, why? What is it that we're trying to unpack? If we're doing, say, Taming of the Shrew, which is super problematic in so many ways, that mostly you don't even have to, it's just unanimously agreed to be pretty problematic. Well, why? Why are we doing this? Is there a way in which you can kind of unpack? Do you lean into the deep sexism of it, or do you kind of subvert it? You know, there are productions that it's all women. It's all women in every single one of the roles. So all of those intensely misogynistic things are being perpetrated by a woman on another woman. Like, what does that mean for us as audience members? I think all of these questions are very much dramaturgical questions. It's about kind of the impact. And I think, you know, even things like casting, in, say, there's a three-hander where there's, again, a man and a woman in a relationship, and a woman comes along and she's, you know, their nanny, and they have an affair with, the man has an affair with the nanny. If the nanny is a person of color, what is that? You know, looking at someone who's in a position of service to potentially a white Anglo couple. What does that say? If the man is a person of color and both women are white or Anglo, what does that say about the kind of story that we're trying to tell? If everyone is of Anglo heritage, then what is that? I think, do we look at disability? Does someone, if we have someone in a position of service who is someone who also has a disability, what does that say about it? I think there's this really interesting thing that happens when we ask these questions about the choices that we make. For example, I watched production, SCC's production of Lord of the Flies. Originally, they're all male characters, but then in the SCC production, it was kind of cast across gender, across ability, across sexuality, across race. But it was very carefully cast in terms of someone with a disability not necessarily being in the role of the person who's picked on or is the victim. So yeah, I think a dramaturgical lens is an approach that we take to our understanding of work and our creation of work. Oh my God, I said I wasn't going to pontificate, and then here we are.
You did not pontificate. You answered the question. It was fabulous. No, that's exactly what I was asking, because when we originally spoke about it, we spoke about who's telling the story, why are they telling the story, what is the context, who is cast, and what is the design. So there's a few factors there that are sort of interesting to make dig into a bit more, what the design might say, and I guess the dramaturg's role in being part of that conversation with the designer. And I guess too, that contextual question of what does it offer Australia or the world right now to, for example, be putting out a play where the only person of colour is in a subservient role or something like that.
Absolutely. And that approach that we take can take two, the same script, and then create completely different productions, completely different responses in audiences. And a lot of it will have to do with the production. And then also, I think it's worth remembering that an element of that is also the audience and what the audience brings. So, there might be a particular play that in one city does particularly well, or, the audiences laugh at all the jokes. There might be another city where all of those fall flat. There might be, something that is actually quite offensive in a particular context, and in another is just kind of humorous. And I think that there isn't necessarily absolutes in that. A lot of it is to do with, how something is produced or how a story is told, and then also how an audience receives it. And I think all of those are questions that dramaturgs are asking all the time. Again, dramaturgs don't have the monopoly on this. I think directors are asking this, writers are asking this, actors are asking this, designers are asking this. But it's very much embedded in the work of the dramaturg.
Love it. And with the couple minutes we've got left, which I can't believe how it's got away from us, I'm kind of interested in some of the characters you have been creating lately, because you've had a really busy 2020, and I've been kind of doing a bit of dipping through some of the stuff you've created this year, including a monologue for Dear Australia and Car Park Clubbing, and a short play for children called Ramadan Rocket Ship, and many others that I probably am not even, haven't particularly read those ones yet. But I guess, where do you feel like at the moment in terms of that that kind of dramaturgical lens and the conversations that you're wanting us to have, and the things you're wanting us to think about, what sort of things are you really interested in writing about and contributing to the conversation at the moment?
I think for me, I'm really, I love people. I mean, again, that's why I've started working in the theatre, because it's one of the arts where you work with people the most. And I think the thing that happens is often the stories of people, there are people on the margins, and it's not everyone's role necessarily to tell those stories. But what we can do is help facilitate that. So the piece that I wrote for Dear Australia, it was a provocation to 50 playwrights around Australia to respond to COVID in whatever way. That didn't have to speak about it directly, but just whatever the response was. And the thing that I kept missing from all the conversations was the role of international students, and how incredibly vulnerable they are generally, but also in this time. I am not an international student. I grew up here, but my parents were international students, and we've talked about their experiences before. And so I thought it was worth writing about someone who potentially we wouldn't have an opportunity to hear from in something like Dear Australia, because obviously it's affected literally everyone across the board. But for me, that was something that I thought was worth looking at. With Ramadan Rocket Ship, so historically I've never really, like when I used to write poetry, I started off as a spoken word poet. I never really talked about being Muslim, because I just didn't need to. Like it was, yeah, it's there, but also I'm right-handed and I wear glasses and I don't write poetry about that either. But like with Ramadan Rocket Ship, I wrote it specifically because, you know, there are young people like me who never think that they're going to be able to work in the theatre, or it just never occurs to them because they haven't seen it. There's not work there that reflects their life experiences. And so for me, that was a conscious effort to write something that is kind of funny and light and loving in a way that feels real for people who might have even a slight overlap with the kinds of experiences I had growing up. So we can see ourselves in the art that we've never been told that we can be a part of before.
I love that. And that's a beautiful closing note, even though there's much more you could say, and because there's a lot of fantastic work you've done this year. I really encourage people to find it, because you can find it online and on Tasnim Hossain's website, and to go on YouTube and watch Car Park Clubbing. I had such a good time watching that as well. So thank you so much for your amazing insights and the great conversation that we've had. We're really lucky. We're going to go into a chat with Toolkit's participants now, but everyone else, thank you for joining us. Feel free to kind of keep the Twitter conversation going if you're having one, and stay well, everyone.